Hi there. Thanks again for joining us for the Marrow Thieves. My name is Emily and I'm with Tutoring with a Twist. So today's chapters, I'll be reading two chapters. The first one's called The Circle, and that's on page 184. And the next chapter is called Word Arrives in Black. Okay, so The Circle, page 184. We were up early the next day, unsure of where to begin a day without running. Very quickly, though, the work of the main camp took over. We spent the morning in assigned chores, gathering water from the rain barrels to boil, coaxing the small vegetables in the garden to stay alive, washing clothes, checking the trap lines. Soon it was lunch and everyone came together in the clearing to eat. "You guys planning a rescue for your elder?" Clarence had sat beside me in a spot where the grass was soft. He was eating dried meat. I had made him promise earlier to teach me how to dry and smoke meat so we could keep it longer when the hunt wasn't so good. I nodded, not wanting to talk anymore, since the asshole from yesterday had sauntered over. Clarence followed my gaze to the boy. "This is my nephew Derek," he told me. "We traveled together from out west. He's a good hunter." By then he was standing in front of us. I had to put my hand up along my brow to block out the sun to see him. I didn't like it looking up at him. I wanted to stand, but didn't want him to think I needed to get up to prove anything. "The best, Uncle. I'm the best hunter." He smirked and slightly kicked the bottom of Clarence's boot with the toe of his own. Yeah, and he's real humble, too." Clarence laughed. "Derek, you know Jean's boy, Francis, eh?" "French," I corrected. "Yeah, sure, I know Francis. I escorted him over here yesterday." He made air quotes around the word escorted. "Whatever, big man with a gun." I decided to ignore him, looking back down at my bowl of salted potatoes. He didn't deserve my attention. "No, Francis, I'm a big man always. Don't need a gun, though I am capable of using one when I have to." Clarence cut the boy off. "Okay, Derek, why don't you get yourself some food over there?" "Yeah, I think I will go get some food, Uncle. I have to check the lines this afternoon. Someone has to feed the women." He stretched out his arm and puffed out his chest before leaving, blocking out the sun so that I was thrown into his shadow. "Don't mind him. He's just looking for something to rub his antlers on. You know what I mean?" Clarence clapped me on the back. "Plus, you have girls in your group. He's just looking to prove himself." He ripped off another hunk of meat and chewed it thoughtfully, looking around the clearing. Suddenly I wasn't hungry anymore. I swallowed what was in my mouth and excused myself. I handed my bowl off to Slopper and a smaller boy his age named Sam, who were the designated dishwashers for the meal, and wandered over by the lodge, planning to walk the perimeter of the clearing just to check things out. I still felt uneasy. Maybe I just needed to get a better handle on where we were and what was ahead of us. I sure as hell didn't want to think about where we'd been and what I'd done. And now we were here with his group, and there was this ass who was trying to impress the girls by being a dick to me. What was up with that? I walked at a brisk pace to avoid the others. I needed to think. "Hey, wait for me!" Rose jogged over. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun that bounced like a pom-pom on a toque as she ran. I kept walking, a little slower than before. "Where are you going?" She caught up and walked beside me. "Thanks for waiting, geez." "Nowhere." She walked at my pace, swinging her arms and kicking at rocks along the way. I made my way over to where the hill started its incline, dotted with low shrubs and a thin veil of elm trees. "Well, what are you doing?" "Nothing." "Nothing?" I just nodded, making my way through the bush, but still behind the trees, so I had a better view of the green bowl of the clearing. Why did things still feel so uncertain, even after I'd found my dad? It had been years since I'd even allowed myself the fantasy of imagining he was still alive, and yet here we were, together. And still, I didn't realize until I'd walked a few feet that Rose was no longer with me. I turned and saw her there at the bottom, arms crossed, hip thrown out. "You coming?" Well, do you want me to? I shrugged. Up to you. She unfolded her arms and placed them on her hips. Then she turned on a heel and stomped away. I shrugged again and walked in the opposite direction. Tonight's social night over in the cave. General was visiting with Migwans when I returned to our group circle of tent. They were chatting in the last moments of daylight. General was a pleasant-looking man who wore his gray hair at shoulder length and had a neck hung with beaded ropes. He smiled a lot, the kind of smile that went right up into his eyes, and maybe for this reason alone, I agreed to follow them over to the cave to check out the festivities. When we got there, they were still clearing up and placing seating in a circle, facing inward towards the center of the space. I excused myself from the two men and made my way over to my father's room. Since the door was a blanket and the walls were mostly fabric, I knocked on the wooden frame around the draped doorway. Dad? Come in. He was sitting on his bed, wrapping his damaged leg in a tensor bandage. He smiled when I entered. He was wearing a long undershirt that had been black at one time, but was now faded to gray, and what looked like a pair of tropical print swimming trunks that hung wide on his thighs. His damp hair was freshly cut, and he smelled like good soap. Boy, I could get used to hearing Dad again, let me tell you. He patted the mattress beside him, and I sat down, sighing as I did. We sat there for a minute, in silence. Boy, what's the matter? I couldn't answer. Instead, I shrugged again, slumping my shoulders after so I could put my elbows on my knees and hold my face in my hands. You sure look like something's the matter. I couldn't answer him because I really wasn't sure what was wrong. On top of that, I felt guilty that I wasn't happier. We'd found Minerva now. All we had to do was get her from the recruiters. And I'd found my dad after all this time. It was really two miracles in one. And all I could do was feel sad and confused. Dad finished wrapping his stump and leaned back on his elbows. French, can you tell me something? Sure, Dad. What is it you're hoping to find out here? I answered too quickly. Minerva. No. I mean, why Minerva? I was getting irritated. What do you mean, why? Because she was taken. I spent the first 2 years in the bush trying to find Mitch after he was taken. Because that's what we do. We look for each other. Didn't you bother to look for us? I regretted it as soon as I'd said it. I did, son. His voice was low but calm. Every day. He rubbed a memory of an injury on the side of his ribs. No matter what, I didn't set up this camp to be my community, Francis. I brought these people together so that we could find our community. But eventually that's what we became in the absence of the other. But it doesn't mean we stop searching. I didn't understand until he said it. That part of my ennui had been resentment. Resentment that my father was out here being all revolutionary while his kids were left with an unstable mother who eventually left us all alone. That I hated him for leaving Mitch to sacrifice himself for me. That I was angry about my childhood left to wither and starve in the woods. He put an arm around my shoulders and shook me a bit as he spoke. No one could have guessed the speed and cruelty of this machine once it started up. No one knew what was coming. If I had, I never would have left that day. I would have taken you and your brother and your ma and run north as fast as I could while I still had both legs. I leaned into his side and just lay there for a minute, listening to the pull and thump of his broken heart against my hard head. I've done things, Dad. He hummed, low in his chest so that it filled my ear with cotton. We all have, son. He kissed the top of my head like he used to when I was little, and I felt that good sense of safety once more, even just for a minute. The blanket at the door was pulled back. Hey, you guys coming or what? A young man I hadn't seen before popped his head into the room, then popped back out. We heard his feet hurry away, and then there was a sound I hadn't heard since I was young. So young that all I remember is the sound, and not where I was or who I was with when I heard it. It was the sound of a drum. They hit the drum tentatively at first, checking for tone and pitch. When we passed the food prep area, I saw Clarence holding it over the homemade element. They simmered with a hole in the dirt ground filled with heated rocks from the fire outside. It was a hand drum, and he held it by the sinew ties, crisscrossing the back, tilting it toward the heat to tighten the skin over the front. We made our way to the circle of seats, and my father took one beside Bullet. I stood on the other side of Dad and looked around. Most of the seats were taken. Half a dozen little kids chased each other in and around the adults who watched with smiles. Bullet seemed to be the oldest one here, and she couldn't have been more than 65. There were about 50 people in total, a big enough group that invisibility, the way we enjoyed it, was out of the question. So they had to live differently, carving out communities in the spaces they felt they could defend. It was a precarious existence, to say the least. Finally, Clarence walked into the center of the circle, clearing his throat in sharp breaths. I liked Clarence and was happy to see him. But then he mentioned to someone in the crowd with his drumstick. I looked over to see Derek, also holding a drum. Damn it. Even worse, standing beside him was Rose. He smiled at her, and she returned the smile before he joined his uncle. The cave darkened as my eyes narrowed. What in the hell was she doing with that jerk? And why was she smiling so big? I puffed out my chest a bit, remembering that I still had the longest braids, even in this larger group. That made me a better Indian, after all. But then the drumming started. Double beat, high and sweet, round dance style. Clarence busted a lead, and then Derek joined in, and damn it all to hell, his voice was amazing. I crossed my arms, refusing to be impacted. My dad tapped his hand on his mangled knee, and Bullet rocked forward and back to the beat. A few of the younger adults stood right away and joined hands, circling the singers in a chain. Some others joined in, and soon the circle was filled with dancers. I kept my arms folded when the clapping and hollering started after that first song. I felt a jealous twitch in my midsection when Wob and Cheeboy and Slopper and everyone else, for that matter, joined in. This twitch turned into a wrench when Clarence raised his voice to declare the next one. The twitch turned into a wrench when Clarence raised his voice to declare the next one was two-step, and Derek handed his drum to Tree. That elicited oohs and ahs from the twins, who put their heads together to examine and admire the instrument. It twisted and yanked on my stomach when I saw Derek weave through the audience to extend a hand towards Rose, who shook her head at first and giggled, but who eventually put her hand in his and allowed herself to be led out into the center. And finally, the jealousy turned to full-blown murder stomping about my guts when I saw them dance hand in hand around the circle. This time, by the time they were facing me, Derek looked me straight in the eyes and smiled the biggest smirk of self-satisfaction you ever could imagine. I turned and left the warmth of the circle, jogging down the corridor and retreating into the dark corner of our camp. Okay, so this chapter is called Word Arrives in Black, and it's on page 192. I woke up early the next morning, still in my clothes from the day before. As was my habit, I slung my rifle onto my back before leaving the tent. Before I could stop myself, I crept over to Rose's tent, unzipped the doorway not more than an inch, and peeked inside. She was alone, curled in her fetal sleeping position on her bedroll. I sighed. Thank God. I tiptoed out of the camp, not wanting to run into anyone yet and have to answer to the "Where were you last night?" or "Why'd you storm away?" questions. "Hey, French, over here." Halfway up the incline of the westward-facing hill, Clarence held his hand up above his head to get my attention. He was with Mig and General and a few of the other men I didn't recognize. They were all wearing shades of green and brown, and two of them had leafy branches stuck through their hats. I waved and made my way over. "You got your gun on ya?" Clarence shook my hand and nodded at the gun barrel over my shoulder. I nodded. All right, Len, let's go. Hunting day. Meg clapped me on the back and smiled, happy to see me there so early. I didn't want to tell him I'd been a fluke, that I'd fallen asleep in fits and spurts and gotten up when I couldn't force my wandering mind to stay stationary anymore. I spent the day in complete silence, trying to emulate the grace of the older men through the woods. Out here, there was water. You could smell it in the air. The more north we got, the more life was left in the woods. I inhaled big. Closer you get to the coasts, Clarence whispered, pointing east, west, and then north. The more water's left that can be drunk. The middle grounds? He made his hands stiff and made a striking motion. Nothing. It's like where the bomb landed and the poison's leached into the banks. Everything's gone in all directions till you get further out. I didn't know what to say. I knew that had been Clarence's traditional territory. Sorry, was all I could manage. If he heard me, he didn't let on. All we need is the safety to return to our homelands. Then we can start the process of healing. I was confused. How can you return home when it's gone? Can't you just heal out here? Meg and General each gave each other knowing looks, and Clarence was patient in his answer. I mean, we can start healing the land. We have the knowledge, kept through the first round of these blasted schools. From before that, from when these visitors first made their way over here like angry children throwing tantrums. When we heal our land, we are healed also. Then he added, we'll get there. Maybe not soon, but eventually. A high whistle came through the trees and General pulled me to the ground with him. I was frantic. Was it the recruiters? I tried to claw my gun strap to pull the weapon to my hands and to the ready. On the other side of me, Mig turned around and put a finger to his lips, shushing my small noises. I heard footsteps, a deep echo in the ground, and then branches breaking. Finally, there was silence, and then another whistle, this one shorter. From around me came the sudden sounds of breath, and I realized we'd all been holding ours, then movement, as everyone scrambled to their feet. Was it recruiters? I asked out loud. Did they get anyone? General answered. No, no, little brother. That was the scouts letting us know they had an animal in sight, one that was the right age to be taken. Sounds like they got it, too. I coaxed my heart back into my normal rhythm and followed the group to where they had, indeed, taken down a good-sized buck. Mig was preparing the ceremony when I got there to send it off in a good way. We allowed the deer to take his dreams with him so he had all the magic he would need to find the next world. We returned mid-afternoon as heroes. I was more than a little smug, trundling down the hill, helping to maneuver the weight of a full-grown buck on the travois we'd strapped together out of branches and sinew. Even though I'd done nothing but tag along and then panic when the kill was actually made. Still, I was there. I was damn near giddy when I saw the look on Derek's face as we passed by where he was leg wrestling with his friends. He had his shirt off and tucked into his back pocket, and I couldn't help but notice the definition of his muscles. I flexed under my sweater. Uncle, I told you to wake me up, he whined, jogging alongside us to speak. I shouldn't have to wake you up. You should be awake and ready like the rest of the men, like French here. I tipped an imaginary hat in his direction and watched the color blossom in his cheeks. He stopped following us, and we made our way to the outdoor kitchen near the mouth of the cave. Oh, French, that's a beautiful buck. It was Rose. She ran over from the clothes washing area and put her hand on my arm. It made me shiver, and I had to try real hard to remember why I was angry with her. But once I had that image of her and Derek, the dink, two-stepping right in front of me, I pulled away from her. Yeah? Why don't you go watch Derek wrestle over there? Pointed with my lips. I'm sure he'd love to have a cheerleader. Her face fell, and I started to feel flustered. What are you doing, Francis? She said it low, since there were others around. Why don't you just call me French? Only people I respect can call me Francis. Couldn't stop myself. I wasn't even sure how much of this I meant. She grabbed me by my elbow and led me through the kitchen and around the perimeter of the hill, back over towards our camp. When we reached the first tent, I shook loose, and she turned on me. What in the hell is your problem? She was only 6 inches from my face, and I could see anger flash in her dark eyes. What do you mean? What's my problem? I'm not the one who's mooning after some jerk with a drum. It was louder than I'd meant it to be. She flinched. You're the jerk around here. You wouldn't even talk to me yesterday, and you expect me to just follow you around or something?" She pursed her lips together when she was done, like she had to struggle to keep back some words. "Oh, I'm sorry. I can't be at your beck and call all the time. I wasn't sure why I'd said it." It's not like she actually expected that. I even screwed up my face and flounced my hands about as if imitating her snobby behavior. Well, this managed to unpurse her lips. "You know what, French? You're different. At first I thought it was because of Riri and Minerva, but no, you're even more different here." Her voice broke on the names a bit, but she took a breath and kept going. "I should just leave. After we find Minerva, I should just go. I don't want to stay around here when you're being such an ass." I'd regret this next line forever. "What, and leave your new boyfriend Derek behind? Whatever. Don't expect me to chase after you." Her eyes filled with tears, and I was ashamed. So ashamed I dropped my head and looked at the ground so that all I saw of her retreat was the movement of her shoes as she took off, sobbing. I waited until I couldn't hear her, until I was able to move my heavy limbs and drooping head. I couldn't go to my tent. I was scared to be alone in there right now. So I trudged the path back to the cave, past the celebrations in the outdoor kitchen, up the corridor and into my father's room. I flopped face first on his bed and stayed that way until he came in an hour or so later. He rustled around for a few minutes and then, satisfied that I was awake, began to speak. "Did I ever tell you about how I ended up in the city?" I shook my head. I couldn't remember even hearing stories about my dad outside of him being my dad. I hadn't even really considered him anything other than that. "I ran away." I should have sat up, showed some interest, but I just couldn't. I heard his calloused palm rub at his mustache like an old habit. The sound made me feel safe and very young. "Yep, I was 13 when I decided." "That young?" "Mm-hmm. I remember that day too. It had rained in the morning, but the sun came out after lunch." Tilted my head towards his voice so that I held my face in the palm of one hand, listening. "Painted wood, when you leave it alone, works itself out, like it needs to get back to an honest shade. It'll fade blue to skinny green. The church where I went that day, it had rubbed itself gray. It made the birch around seem real stark by comparison, like bone splinters sticking out of the ground like that." He settled his weight on the bed beside me and continued. "I remember the old people used to say that the church was a medicine house. I sat there that day on top of my backpack in the aisle between two rows of pews, so rough they'd cut your legs if you wore shorts to service, and thought, this doesn't look like no medicine house to me. They used to say that men who came in and left as something entirely different, something with hands that wouldn't obey natural law and hearts and heavy and empty at the same time. Me, I needed something to change. Maybe that's why I went out there to that church. Nothing seemed solid to me anymore, like everything was a drawing of what it was supposed to be. You know, I felt like my hands would pass right through the door when I showed up. But that day my hands needed to touch something real." He extended his arthritic fingers out in front of him, throwing shadows over the bedspread. "That church sat in the woods behind our rec center. It was like a small comma in a long sentence. It was shallow and narrow, not much bigger than the portable where Mrs. Gunther taught English with Reader's Digest magazines. When it was used, it held about 20 people or so. That's at best. 15 if the choir boys were at service. Me, I didn't give a shit about God or Jesus, one way or another. But I knew this would be the last place they'd look. If my mare decided to get up that day and she knew me anymore, she might come. I didn't care. She'd be better off talking to the wood bugs outside. She'd get a better response. They wouldn't think up new swears to yell at her or jab her with sticks sharpened by Grandpa's old hunting knife. But then, I might not either. But you never could tell by then. I couldn't guarantee anything." His voice sounded far away. I turned so that I was facing him now. He spoke to a spot over my head and nearer to the wall, like this was a story that was written in the space between us. "The rages came at the weirdest of times then. Eating Cheerios, watching music videos, hanging out. A garbage can got set on fire outside the school. I couldn't even tell you for sure it was me." He kind of laughed there, laugh with no joy in it. Then I thought, geez, what if it isn't my mom that finds me here? The thought made the back of my knees prickle. What if it was one of them in a pickup truck or a dirt bike? In a shiny government black car, one hand outstretched, the other hidden behind a back. His body went rigid. I read the stress in the veins that popped, anxious braille, into his neck. His eyes looked at something I couldn't see. And what was there even to keep me safe? What, a broken crucifix, maybe? My pocket knife? I was 13 then, not old enough to fight a grown man. So I did the only thing that came to mind just then. Something I'd done only once or twice before when shit got real bad. I got to my knees, pressed my fingers so tight the skin around my bitten nails ached, and prayed. I needed an answer. I prayed and prayed, closing my eyes so tight I saw constellations on my eyelids. And I listened for an answer. I listened and I heard a bird. I heard a cricket. And I heard some kids yelling for someone to pass the ball. And then it was the answer. It was the smooth swish of metal and rubber on the Trans-Canada, tied like a ribbon of tar over the brush. Old Highway 11. So I nodded my thanks to the blind Christ and threw my backpack over one shoulder. I was scared, but more scared of staying. I knew at least on the other side there could be a place, any place, where hands couldn't reach. We were quiet for a minute. He was so still it frightened me. Then he pulled away from wherever he had gone and smiled at me. I went to the city after that, bummed around for a bit, tried to stay away from the cops and then the military when they took over. I found your mom there. She was the most beautiful girl in the world, and I mean as dirt when she wanted to be, but not to me. Oh. He smiled real big then, and there was joy in that. I was so happy, French. She made me feel like I was important, like a captain of industry or a scientific genius. And that was just from the look she'd give me when I was doing nothing special at all. It was amazing, really. Now that's medicine. Don't need no damn house to keep it in. He nodded his head as if convincing me of the truth of it. Then from out in the cave came the shuffle of feet down the corridor and voices getting louder into the valley. "Jean, ask him!" It was Clarence shouting for my dad. We both stood, and I helped him up and out. I slung my rifle forward as we made our way down the hall and into the valley. Chiboy popped out of the shadows as if he'd been waiting there all along on a spring. "They're on the move. Tomorrow." It was an old man in black robes, waving his arms while he shouted, half out of breath. The sound of air being punched out of a gut came from Mig. He'd come from the kitchen to stand behind me. "Priest," he managed. I raised the rifle so he was in my sight. Chiboy rushed towards the man, lowering his shoulder in tackle position. "French, wait! Chiboy!" It was my dad, yelling with his hand up towards us. Chiboy stopped his charge midway. "This is Father Carroll. He's our guy on the inside." I lowered the gun and turned instead to brace Mig, who was bent over with his hands over his knees, pale with the shock of seeing a school official. "Carroll has news about Minerva." The older man sighed his relief and tried again. "They're moving her tomorrow morning. They'll be taking her to the airstrip just west of here to fly her into the capital." My heart sank. The capital? How would we get her on time? "Well, I guess that's it then." He kicked a rock that skidded to a stop just in front of the priest. "No, son." Dad was smiling. "That's great news." I squinted at him. "How do you figure?" It was Father Carroll, confident he wasn't about to be mowed down by a bunch of angry Indians, who answered, "Because, my dear boy, they must pass right by here on the Trans-Canada to get from Espanola to the airstrip. They'll be bringing her right to us."